and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Now, just a quick reminder, this program is listener supported, so please do consider becoming a patron through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/justandsinner. If you're looking on the video here, there will be a link in the description below. We have a Discord server that was just set up for second-tier supporters, so those who give $6 or more a month. Really not that much, but it really helps us to do all the things that we do here. But it does give you access to the Discord server, which I've been pretty active on, and other people have been active on as well, if you want to have some good theological discussion there. So consider it. Anyway, check it out. Also, if you haven't yet, check out my new website that I put together. The reason I put together the website is just because people are often looking for resources of things that I've done on various topics, and they tend to be spread out all over the place. So I've got one consistent website to where everything is all put together. It's jordanbcooper.com. So go ahead and check that out if you want other resources as well. So I do have a little bit of a cold right now that I'm getting over, so I can't talk very well, so we'll see just how this goes. I haven't had a voice for the last couple days, so I may need to cut things short just depending on how it goes, but we will see. So this week I released a video on, which was titled 5 Reasons I Am Not Roman Catholic, and I want to talk a little more in depth about some of the things that were discussed in that particular video. Now, that's part of a series of videos that I've been doing called the 5 Reasons series, and it's something that tends to be the most popular stuff that I do on YouTube. I don't know, people like lists, I guess, so that tends to be the stuff that gets far more views than everything else. And people like short little snippets and things like that. So basically just 20 minutes long, and it gives kind of 5 basic reasons I'm not Roman Catholic, doesn't cover everything. And I'll probably do some more dealing with various other, denominations and issues as well. But I had a bunch of questions, of course, about Roman Catholicism when I posted that, and Roman Catholics, of course, come to, defend various claims and things like that, which is to be expected. The comments on YouTube are usually a little crazy. These actually weren't as bad as I expected. But I wanted to talk a little more about a few of the things. One of the things is the arguments for the papacy. Because really, if you go back and think about the foundational element of Roman Catholicism, which really differentiates it from the other branches of Christianity. If you're going to say there's one kind of distinctive belief that defines Lutheranism, let's say, we would say that is justification, right? It's our perspective on justification by faith. Martin Luther calls it the doctrine upon which the church stands or falls. It's called the center of our theology. Various terms have been used to describe the importance of justification. And it ends up being kind of a lens by which we understand many other things. Not that it is the definitive doctrine that kind of overrides other doctrines, but I think what justification does is it gives us a mode of understanding other doctrines and how we explain those doctrines. For example, the way that we view the attributes of God. It's not to say that the Roman Catholic and Lutheran churches have very different doctrines of God, because when we're speaking of theology proper, our doctrine of God is pretty much identical. As on the whole, but the way that those truths are applied to sinners, or the way that the truths of the doctrine of God are spoken about in a sermon, and pastorally what they mean to individuals, that is very much going to be differentiated in terms of the doctrine of justification. So things like the wrath of God, the love of God, those things are going to find different expressions because of this core teaching of justification. And that's really what it means, that justification is this central doctrine for Lutheranism. So everything's going to kind of be funneled through it. Doesn't mean that other doctrines aren't important, of course. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't matter if you have a right doctrine of God or of Christ, as long as you got justification right. No, but just pastorally, and in terms of application, it affects all of these other various doctrines. So, but if we're going to say that there's any kind of central dogma of Rome, which, we wouldn't really say, wouldn't really be accurate. But if there's any one thing that Rome believes that if that one thing was, gotten rid of, the whole structure would fall apart, that really is the papacy. So if there's any equivalent to the centrality of the doctrine of justification in Lutheranism for Rome, that would be the papacy. So everything really kind of rides on that, what's going on with the papacy, what are the claims of the papacy. If the papacy is valid, if Jesus really did establish Peter as the head of the church and his successors as the heads of the church, the infallible head of the church, if that's true, then we should be Roman Catholic. That proves Roman Catholicism correct, right? That is the doctrine that everything else hinges on for them. And if we are to prove that Peter indeed did not have successors who Jesus directly appoints as the head of the church, who are the ones through whom unity is to be expressed and all need to submit to those individuals, then Roman Catholicism itself falls apart. So everything really hinges on the doctrine of the papacy, or understandings of the papacy. So we're going to look at just some ideas related to the papacy, and we can't get into everything because there's so much that we could talk about with the papacy that's also really important. But I think, what you see just in the comments on the video are some very basic Roman Catholic polemics and arguments for the papacy that give us a basic handle on the kind of arguments that people often make. So we're going to just look into some of those basic arguments today as we get started looking at this. All right. So the primary place that Roman Catholics are going to go, and this is the foundational text for these arguments for the papacy, and these rose pretty early on with people like Pope Leo making these kinds of claims about themselves, and later popes throughout the Middle Ages generally hinge their argument on Matthew 16 more than any other text. And this is one that should be pretty well known by anybody who's ever delved into these debates. And, even in the video that I posted on Roman Catholicism, of course, there are a bunch of comments pointing to Matthew 16, and there are a bunch of common arguments that are made by Roman Catholics and common arguments that they expect Protestants to make as well on these issues. So let's just look at Matthew 16, and let's start at verse 13, just to get some context here. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "What do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." But he said to them, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Okay, so that's the text in short. Okay, so what we have here is Peter's great confession of Jesus as the Son of the living God. Peter recognizes who Jesus is. We're told that God himself has revealed this truth to Peter in terms of who Jesus is. And then Jesus gives this blessing to Peter. And so this idea in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's taught that what Jesus does here is he says, "You are Peter upon this rock," meaning Peter's the rock. "Upon you I will build my church." And then he gives the keys of the kingdom of heaven specifically to Peter. And then those keys are passed on from Peter to the popes, who are the successors of St. Peter, the bishops of Rome. That's a lot to read into that text, I think, first of all. The primary point that I bring up first is this text says absolutely nothing about Peter having successors. It says absolutely nothing about Peter passing on these keys of the kingdom of heaven to his successors. It says absolutely nothing about, these keys, meaning that Peter and his successors would have infallibility, would be the heads of the church. All of this comes from later history, and it's very much read into this text. All we're told in this text is that Peter is blessed, and there are these things called the keys of the kingdom of heaven that are given to Peter, and that results in this power of forgiveness, binding sins on earth, and in heaven, and then freeing those from sins on earth and in heaven. So let's talk about what that means. So the primary place where the Roman Catholic argument starts is in making an identification between the rock and Peter. Okay, so Peter's name Petros means rock, and the term that Jesus uses in Matthew's gospel is Petra, to refer to rock later. So upon you, Petros. Okay, so sorry, you are Peter Petros. And upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church. So the argument is there's overlap between Petros and Petra. And so what Jesus is trying to say here essentially is that Peter is that rock upon which he builds the church. And Protestant commentators generally have handled this in a couple different ways. One is to point out that the fact that there is a masculine and then there is a feminine. So there is a distinction between Peter as Petros and the rock, which is Petra. So there is a difference in language there, and that may be a way of Matthew hinting that these are not exactly identical things that are being spoken about here, because Jesus does not say Petros both times. Now, the response to that from Rome and Roman apologists oftentimes is to say, well, Jesus wasn't speaking Greek, Jesus was speaking Aramaic, and the term Kepha, which we know as the background for the term Cephas, which is what Peter is often called throughout the New Testament. The Aramaic term that would have been used there is no differentiation between masculine and feminine in terms of both the name and the noun. So Jesus himself, when he originally spoke in Aramaic, would have been using the same term both times. That's kind of a I'm sorry, but I think that's kind of a silly argument. I just don't think it really makes sense of what's going on in the writing of the Gospels. So, Matthew writes this in Greek and writes down the words in a very specific way for the readers of that Gospel to understand. So I'm not convinced that you can try to make a theological argument by what the original authors would have said and the way that these things would have been worded in the original language in which they were spoken face to face. The Gospels write things in very particular ways because they're trying to get across very particular ideas. So for example, this is the case when anybody, tells a story or tells history, you may be writing out, a sentence that someone said, and it's a truthful sentence, but perhaps the word order of the person in speaking was actually different than in the actual sentence. So you see this in the Gospels. You'll find the same events a couple times. Maybe the words aren't exactly in the same order, but it's the truths are the same because that is in essence what Jesus said. It's not, lying or false about what Jesus said. But the gospel writers put things in such a way and use certain wording to get specific ideas across through the words of Jesus. And they're writing in Greek. So there's necessarily just going to be a little bit of a differentiation between the exact way in which Jesus said things and then the way that the gospel writers put them out, because Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic. And so they have to make a decision. How are we going to translate this in Greek that gets across the idea of what Jesus was trying to say and also get it to fit then with the broader thematic construction of the gospels? So that's what's going on here. So we can't really just go back. I mean, we could do this so many other times in Greek and try to find other meanings behind what Jesus said by saying, well, what would this have actually been in Aramaic, and trying to piece together exactly what the wording was in Aramaic. No, they wrote them in Greek for a reason, so we don't go back to a different language and then try to figure this out. Now, some would argue that Matthew actually wrote in Hebrew or Aramaic. That's not a totally, bizarre idea. Papacy talks about this, so there are some early church attestations of an earlier version of Matthew's gospel, which possibly was written in Hebrew Aramaic. We don't know that that's the case. We have no evidence that this exists. It may have been, but again, we can't just make these decisions theologically based on what something may have said. Okay, that's just not how we do interpretation of New Testament texts. And we don't do this anywhere else. So I find that a difficult argument. But nonetheless, okay, so let's just say that that's the true. Okay, say that, they're both masculine. There's no difference between the terms. We still have, and that's not an argument that I've even generally made, is the Petros argument that often, I think it does point to there is a slight difference in reference, but Jesus, of course, is using wordplay here. So obviously he is, that's why he says, you are Peter. Usually you wouldn't just say this to somebody in conversation, talking to, somebody named Joe. You are Joe. You don't, of course, they didn't know that. So he does bring up the name Peter even in conversation on purpose to make this parallel. So of course there is a very obvious wordplay going on here. But one thing that I think is really important that often gets kind of ignored in some of these discussions is just the subject that Jesus is talking to. Okay, and notice that subject changes. So in the one sentence he says, you are Peter, right? So this is second person, right? Singular. You are Peter. I'm talking directly to you, Peter. And then he switches to third person and says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Okay, still speaking to Peter directly, but then saying, this rock I will build my church. So that's pretty significant grammatically. And there's something that I think is actually a stronger argument than doing the Petros thing anyway. And that is to say that the subject changes from second person to third person. You, this. Okay, so he doesn't say, you are Peter, and upon you I will build my church. He says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And what is the rock? Well, what possibly could be a this rather than a you when he's speaking directly to Peter? The only thing that fits that is the confession that he just made, which is the truth that Jesus is the Son of God. Okay, so this is, I think, the most obvious understanding of this text. Grammatically, it makes the most sense to say, this is the rock. And this isn't disconnected from Peter either. Okay, so he's obviously using this wordplay on purpose. So there is a connection between the this, or the confession, and Peter himself, because Peter is the one who makes this confession. And so he says, yeah, Peter, you are the one that has made this confession. You are the one that the Spirit has revealed this to you. And so that name of rock is pretty appropriate because he's the one who has identified this rock and made the confession, which is the very foundation of the church, the confession that is Jesus Christ himself. So there certainly is a connection there. So again, there's nothing in this text that says anything about Peter being the Pope. Now, he does go on to say, to do this thing, which is the giving of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Which says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so Jesus, first he says, this is the rock upon which I will build my church. In other words, the confession that Jesus is the Christ, that's the very foundation of the church, because Jesus himself is the foundation of the church. This kind of language, he's the chief cornerstone. This is used throughout the New Testament as well. And then this idea of the keys of the kingdom of heaven essentially is the power of binding sins and loosening sins, the power of forgiving and excommunicating. That's the authority with which Jesus has endowed the church. And he does first give these keys, this authority, he does give it first to Peter. He does. And that doesn't mean, however, that this is now given to all of Peter's successors who are the bishops of Rome. We just do not see that at all. So what people often do, okay, in Roman Catholic polemics, especially in addressing this particular text, is they go to the church fathers and they look up, various passages or see how they interpret this particular text in commentaries or sermons. And they take an isolated quote where those church fathers speak very explicitly about the fact that Peter is the chief of the apostles, and none of the other apostles had the faith of Peter, and Jesus praises Peter and his confession. And then try to make the claims from that therefore they accepted the claims of the papacy. Now, I actually got a whole comment on that last video that was just someone listing all these passages of the church fathers, and none of them actually speak about the papacy at all. The fact is, Peter was the chief apostle. Okay, this is not the area of dispute. we don't dispute the fact that Peter was the leader of the apostles. That's clear. Okay. Yes, he does have a particular position of authority. He does tend to be kind of the mouthpiece of the rest of the apostles. Sometimes that's for good, as in here, but other times that's not good. Okay. Peter's also the one who denies Christ. Peter's the one who even compromises, in Galatians. Paul has to call him out. So Peter's not portrayed as this perfect figure, but he is certainly portrayed as one who is a leader. And at this time, he certainly is the leader of the apostles. That doesn't mean that he takes absolutely every leadership position throughout the history of the church. We see that in that Paul takes a strong leadership position to the Gentiles, and James is the one who seems to be the head of the Council of Jerusalem, which I think does tend to be a little bit of a problem if you're looking at this from the perspective of modern Roman Catholicism and claims about the papacy. If those ideas were all there in the form that they are today, we would think that Peter would feature much more prominently in a different way. And I don't think you'd see Paul calling him out in the way that he does in Galatians either. So we do see Peter as a leader, and that's not a problem. Okay, it's not a problem to say that Peter was the chief apostle. There necessarily are going to be kind of authority structures anywhere. And so, yes, he does kind of set himself up. He's got this leadership potential. And if you look at, the time of the Reformation, even if you see, what Melanchthon, for example, says about the papacy, he would say, he'd be fine with the Bishop of Rome being, the primary bishop of the church. That's fine if we understand this as a human right and not some kind of divinely appointed office that this is indeed the vicar of Christ on earth. That's where you run into problems. So there's no problem in saying Peter is the chief apostle. And that is something that the fathers say. Yes, the fathers often praise Peter. Any commentator or good preacher is going to praise Peter too, especially when he confesses Jesus is the Christ. That doesn't bring with it all of this other stuff, okay? And that's what Roman Catholic apologists do is, you've got these whole books that are just citations from the fathers about Peter. And every quote that says Peter does something great, or Peter was the chief apostle, or, Jesus gives this, praises to Peter. Anytime this happens, it's like you compile all these quotes together and say, look, the church fathers said a lot of nice things about Peter and how great he was. Therefore, they all believe the claims of the papacy in the way that they're declared, say Vatican I, 1870, the infallibility of the papal office, which is just not the case. It's not an honest reading of the text at all. And you always hear all these comments from, these lay Roman Catholic apologists who say, oh, you're just not reading the fathers. If you read the fathers, you would see that they were all Roman Catholic and you would be Roman Catholic too. And then if you speak to those same individuals, they haven't read the fathers other than, the Jurgen volumes, which I have down here, of quotes from the fathers, which are very selectively in there, right? I mean, this is Roman Catholic people putting in quotations and notions in the fathers that happen to agree with what they're saying. It gives you this false impression. I did my first master's thesis, because I've got 3 master's degrees. I know, strange, long story. But so I did my first master's thesis on patristic theology, and I was very much steeped in the fathers. And pretty much, even in undergrad, when I wrote any papers in theology, my final papers for almost every class were like the church fathers on this, or some aspect of the church fathers. So, I've spent a lot of time in the fathers. The more time I've spent in the fathers, the less conceivable the claims of Rome are. Okay, I've been less and less convinced of Rome. Not that I was ever convinced, but I remember having this kind of feeling when I looked into the church fathers of, whoa, what if I see that they all believed what Rome believes? And just because of some of the claims that are often made. But when I actually read through them, like, these are not, they're not speaking about things in the way that a modern day Roman Catholic would. They're not speaking about Peter as they would speak about Peter if they really believed the claims of Rome today, say Vatican I. They're definitely not speaking, to the Pope in ways that make sense of a claim that people would have today. So these ideas, are just not there in the fathers in the way that they are. You might think they are by taking selective quotations. So when you read the fathers, don't just read selective quotations. It's just not a helpful way of doing anything. Protestants do it too. Okay, there are plenty of Protestant volumes on the fathers. They're just a bunch of random citations of the fathers, and they're totally out of context, and it makes them sound like something they're not. Just get a whole book, right? I had those, those commentaries that are of the just citations from the church fathers. I had a bunch of those. I just got rid of them yesterday because I was cleaning out I have no room in this office. I have too many books. It's not possible really, but I have, there are limits in terms of space, and I have books everywhere in this apartment. So, anyway, so I was going through stuff and I just got rid of those volumes because I realized, like, what's the point of this? I don't like this idea of just, you can pull out citations of anybody and say, this seems to say this, or this seems to say this. Read the commentaries of the fathers. Don't read just selections of quotes out of context. We wouldn't do this with anybody else. So why do we do it with the church fathers? But everybody does it with the church fathers. It just seems to be the thing to do. So, I don't know, pick up a volume of Chrysostom and one of his, series on, is Matthew or Galatians or Romans. I mean, they're excellent. Just read those and read the whole thing. Don't just read random citations. Somehow with the fathers, we all think that that's somehow okay, and it gets frustrating. So what I want to do is now look at some things from the fathers, now that I've kind of gone over that. I want to look at some things of the fathers and show where I don't think the claims of Rome historically really make much sense. Now, I think the earliest problematic thing in church history that we find, and we can look at some things in the New Testament too. Like I said, the way that Paul speaks about Peter, in Galatians and just the setup of the Council of Jerusalem, it certainly doesn't seem to be the way the church would have operated had the church had an understanding of Peter that Rome now does. But let's look at some things in the early church. So the earliest thing is from Ignatius. Okay, so we're looking at 2nd century here. Saint Ignatius writes these 7 letters. Some have argued for more and less because there are more than that, but people have argued which ones are actually authentic. Generally, it's conceded that 7 are authentic. There have been some publications of people that have tried to argue that only 5 are, but so one of those is the letter to the Romans. It's generally regarded as this is authentic. Ignatius did write this. And so Ignatius is one who writes a lot about the episcopacy. He writes 2 churches, speaking about a number of different issues. What he writes about more than anything else is martyrdom, because he's going to be martyred. He knows that he's going to be martyred. He's trying to keep people strong in the faith, encouraging them in difficult times. Great evidence for early confessions of the divinity of Christ in Ignatius and all sorts of other things. And one of the things that he does talk about is unity in the church and in the importance of being submissive and obedient to those who are in leadership in the church. Specifically, he talks about bishops, and that shows up in a lot of his letters. The interesting thing is that it doesn't show up in the one place where you'd think it would show up more than anywhere else, and that is in the letter to the Romans. So he has a greeting and a conclusion, right? So you'd think either in the greeting here, he'd say, Church of Rome, head of the church, place of the office of Saint Peter, the infallible, head of the church. He doesn't do that. This is what he says, and it's very basic, his salutation. Ignatius, the image bearer to the church that has found mercy in the majesty of the Father Most High and Jesus Christ, his only Son. The church beloved and enlightened through the will of the one who willed all things to exist in accordance with faith in and love for Jesus Christ our God, which also presides in the place of the district of the Romans. Worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy of sanctification, and presiding over love, observing the law of Christ, bearing the name of the Father, which I also greet in the name of Jesus Christ, Son of the Father, to those who are united in flesh and spirit to every commandment of his, who have been filled with the grace of God without wavering and filtered clear of every alien color. Heartiest greetings, blamelessly in Jesus Christ our God. Beautiful greeting. I mean, this is a wonderful greeting. A great confession that Jesus is God. I mean, multiple times in this short greeting. And he says praises to Rome. And he says, you're worthy of love and honor, and you've been sanctified, and you love the Lord, and you have faith in Jesus. He encourages them in very basic ways. there's nothing in this greeting that you would expect had Ignatius had this developed theology of Rome and the successors of Peter. And he doesn't greet the head of the church. Little weird, right? I mean, why would Ignatius not give a greeting at the beginning to the head of the church? But maybe this comes later. So let's look at a place where he does give, personal greetings. In the Michael Holmes translation, which is what I'm using, that's pretty much the standard best edition of the Apostolic Fathers out today. So if you want to look at this yourself, the heading here says personal greetings and parting requests. So there is where you'd think that this would be addressed. He says, remember in your prayers the church of Syria, which has God for its shepherd in my place. Jesus Christ alone will be its bishop, as will your love. So he is talking about bishops and the authority of Jesus in the church. But I myself am ashamed to be counted among them, for I am not worthy, since I am the very last of them, of an untimely birth. But I have been granted mercy to be someone if I reach God. My spirit greets you, as does the love of the churches that welcomed me in the name of Jesus Christ, rather than as a mere transient. For even churches that did not lie on my way, that is my physical route, went before me from city to city. I write these things to you from Smyrna through the Ephesians, who are most worthy of blessing. With me, along with many others, is Crocus, a name very dear to me, regarding those who preceded me from Syria to Rome, to the glory of God. I believe you have information. Let them know that I am near, for they are all worthy of God and of you, and it is quite proper for you to refresh them in every respect. I am writing these things to you on the 9th day before the calends of September. Farewell until the end in the patient endurance of Jesus Christ. What's not there? What's absent? Okay, no mention of the Bishop of Rome, the head of the church, the successor of St. Peter, the one to whom the keys of the kingdom of heaven belong. And you can't make a full argument based on what's not said, but it is pretty telling. And some of the questions you have to ask, I think, when you're reading the Church Fathers is, if they believed X, how would they speak? And so it might not, you're not going to find citations, where Ignatius is like, by the way, there is no Bishop of Rome, and by the way, the Pope isn't infallible and the Bishop of Rome isn't head of the church. I mean, you're not going to find that. So you're dealing with evidence of absence in some ways, because you're what you have to do is establish a positive case that these understandings were there in the early church. Now, maybe they were in a time of transition between bishops of Rome, but it is the one place in the early church where you'd think more than anywhere else there would be some clear evidence, and it's not there. So the other place that we would go is First Clement, and this would be an obvious one because Clement is in Rome, and he's writing this letter. This is at the very end of the first century. Again, different discussions about the exact date, but it is at the very end of the first century, at some time, 90 to 100 AD or so, that Clement is writing this. Now, in the Roman Catholic tradition, in histories of the popes, it's understood that Clement is the third Bishop of Rome. He's the third pope. So there was one in between Peter and Clement. But so this would be understood that Clement is now writing this letter to the Corinthians as a pope. Okay, he's writing as a pope in the Roman Catholic tradition. But that does not appear to be how Clement himself is writing. Now, I'm just going to read from the introduction of Michael Holmes. And Michael Holmes is an expert in the Apostolic Fathers, perhaps the expert in the Apostolic Fathers. He's produced the definitive translation that pretty much everyone is using today. And he says this in his introduction. In terms of authorship, he says, the unity of style suggests that the letter is the work of a single author. While the letter, which was sent on behalf of the whole church, does not name its writer, well-attested ancient tradition and most manuscripts identify it as the work of Clement, whose precise identity, however, is not clear. Tradition identifies him as the third bishop of Rome after Peter, but this is unlikely because the office of monarchical bishop, in the sense intended by this later tradition, does not appear to have existed in Rome at this time. Leadership appears to have been entrusted to a group of presbyters or bishops, among whom Clement almost certainly was if not the, leading figure. Okay, so we have a citation there that he gives from 1 Clement 44, 1 through 6. So let's look at that and see what this says here. He says, "Our apostle likewise knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife over the bishop's office. For this reason, therefore, having received complete foreknowledge, they appointed the leaders mentioned earlier, and afterwards they gave the offices a permanent character. That is, if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry." So we do have, the apostles set up a following ministry that was going to succeed their deaths. "These, therefore, who were appointed by them or later on by other reputable men with the consent of the whole church, and who have ministered to the flock of Christ blamelessly, humbly, peaceably, unselfishly, and for a long time have been well spoken of by all, these we consider to be unjustly removed from their ministry. For it will be of no small sin for us if we depose from the bishop's office those who have offered the gifts blamelessly in holiness. Blessed are those presbyters who have gone on ahead, who took their departure at a mature and fruitful age, for they need no longer fear that someone may remove them from their established place. For we see that you have removed certain people, their good conduct notwithstanding, from the ministry that have been held in honor by them blamelessly." So what we have here is, the Corinthian church is a mess, just like it was in the New Testament, which is what's interesting. They fall back into the same sins that they had then. Unfortunately, we like to think that we learn from our mistakes, but we're sinners, so we don't. So the church in Corinth is still, it's a mess. They're dividing against one another. They're trying to, depose people from the office of bishop in Corinth. But what's interesting here is that the office of bishop is a plural office. And so there are bishops, there are multiple bishops at this time, at least in some churches. Now, by the time of Ignatius, which isn't that much later, there clearly are head bishops. So this process of going from there being multiple bishops in a district to being one head bishop over the others, or in this distinction between presbyter and bishop, this does happen, pretty early on. It does happen in the 2nd century. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think there's a problem with it. I think it's a good structure. I think there's a reason why the church has kept that structure, so I'm not opposed to the episcopal office at all. I think it can be a very positive thing. To say that it's necessary and divinely appointed, I don't think I would go that far. But we do see this from even, Jerome recognizes this. St. Jerome, who's, no Protestant. He's a church father. He's not Roman Catholic necessarily either, but Saint Jerome acknowledges this, and he says that at once the office of presbyter and episkopos, right, the bishop and the elder or the pastor, they were the same office, and eventually throughout the 2nd century they end up developing into 2 separate offices, and that seems to fit with what First Clement does. It would be very strange, very strange, for Bishop Clement, Pope Clement, to write this to the Corinthians, to even speak about the fact that the apostles made sure that they had others that would succeed them in their ministry, that the whole church would, call certain people to be pastors, to be leadership in the church, that he would have this whole discussion, and he would never mention the fact that Jesus appointed him to be the very head of the church. And the Corinthians should probably listen to him because guess what? Clement is the head of the church. You'd think that this would show up somewhere, and there is a perfect place for it. And it's not like, to say, oh, Clement's just being humble and not bringing these things up. It would be very relevant to his argument, and it would be very relevant to what he's trying to do. It's just not there. So the only mention of bishops we have seems to be that there are multiple in each church, including Rome. So the earliest evidence we have outside of the New Testament of what's going on in the Roman Church is from Clement, who by the end of the 1st century seems to have an idea that there are multiple bishops who are presbyters who are in charge of the church. So basically multiple pastors in the Church of Rome. And then by the time of Ignatius, we're getting into now the beginnings of the 2nd century, we have seemingly no bishop at all in Rome still. So from the evidence we have, and it's difficult because there is very little evidence, so we have to acknowledge that. We don't have as much evidence as we want throughout the 2nd century. That transition between the death of the apostles and the beginnings of the church, unfortunately, it's so lacking in material. It's the era that we all want to understand, but there's just not much there. They're under persecution. They're trying to figure things out. They don't even have the whole New Testament put together. They're trying to just do all this stuff. So they're not writing extensive treatises until we get to Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. But at this point, from the evidence we have, it does not appear that there even is a bishop in Rome. Nonetheless, that bishop, through apostolic succession, has now received the keys of the kingdom of heaven from Peter and is the head of the entire church. And now magically I have a sweater on. Yeah, I have to keep stopping this. I'm sick, so I'm trying to keep myself warm with some coffee here too. So, all right. So the thing that I want to talk about now is Saint Cyprian, just as a kind of example of how, first of all, Roman Catholic apologists misuse the fathers in their defense of the claims of the papacy, but then also just how the fathers didn't have the high views of the papacy that it's often assumed that they did have. Now, Cyprian is interesting because his treatise on the unity of the church is very influential within the history, specifically of the medieval church. What's most famous in Saint Cyprian is his claim that there is no salvation outside of the church, of the Catholic Church. And this is a treatise that is against the Novatians, Donatists later, who split away from the unity of the church. They're schismatics, and this lays out a bunch of controversies that occur, especially through someone like St. Augustine later in the church. So in this particular treatise, he does speak very highly of the Bishop of Rome, and he speaks about Matthew 16. So this is something that's very often cited within Roman Catholic apologetic texts. And so I'm reading from the treatises of Cyprian. This is the first treatise. I'm looking in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 5. Text right here. You can find this for free online if you want to read it yourself. Go to the treatises of Cyprian, look at the first one on the unity of the church, and this starts in part 4. All right. The Lord speaks to Peter, saying, I say unto thee, thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound also in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again to the same he says, after the resurrection, feed my sheep. And although to the apostles, after his resurrection, he gives an equal power, and says, as the Father has sent me, even so I send you, receive the Holy Ghost. Whosoever sins ye remit, they shall be remitted unto him, and whoever sins they retain, they shall be retained. Yet that he might set forth unity, he arranged by his authority the origin of that unity as beginning from one. Assuredly, the rest of the apostles were also the same as was Peter, endowed with a like partnership both of honor and power, but the beginning proceeds from unity. So this is really pretty clear that this is Cyprian. I mean, he lays out his notion of the office of Peter and what the office of the Bishop of Rome is. So he says basically that Jesus wanted unity in the church, and he wanted to show that there was a singular place from which the rest of the church derived its authority, primarily, really, ultimately from himself, but then he first gives it to Peter, and then through Peter it is given to the rest of the apostles. But what is interesting is he does say things like he gives an equal power to the other apostles, and then he does say, let's see, they have a like partnership both of honor and power. So he doesn't seem to hold the notion that the Bishop of Rome, and you can read this yourself, it's free online if you want to find this. So he doesn't seem to think that there's anything inherently better about the Bishop of Rome, but there is a kind of primacy in honor, perhaps, of the Bishop of Rome that we see as one that is pretty common in the early church. And so by this time, the bishops of Rome have started to try to make the arguments that they are special. They are a rock upon which the church is built, in some sense, dealing with Matthew 16. And so it's citations in Cyprian that speak about the unity of the church, the importance of Peter, that they like to cite to try to argue for their particular views on the papacy. But I think that is all to be understood in light of what happened later in Cyprian's life. Now you have to understand what's going on in Cyprian's life and the controversy surrounding things in the early church at this point. So Cyprian is involved in a controversy over what to do with heretics who baptize, and specifically schismatics who baptize. And there's a debate in the church, and this continues for quite a while. There's a debate in the church over what to do about the baptism of heretics. If a heretic baptizes you, but they baptize you in the triune name, does that baptism still count, or do you need to get rebaptized by one who is orthodox and in the fellowship of the rest of the church? So does a baptism by a schismatic count, yes or no? So what happens is Cyprian has one view of the issue. The Bishop of Rome has another view of the issue. And so what's interesting here is how Cyprian interacts with this idea. So the Bishop of Rome basically says that baptisms, if they're done in the name of the triune God, that they are to be accepted, right? They're valid baptisms, because the importance is really in what God is doing, not in the person doing it per se. So as long as the triune name is expressed, the word is there, the sacrament is administered validly, it is a valid baptism, the person doesn't need to be rebaptized. Okay, that is the Bishop of Rome's position on the issue. Now, I would say for sure the Bishop of Rome is absolutely correct. This is the right position on the issue to hold. But what's interesting is Cyprian's response. So Cyprian responds with a series of letters, and they're found in this volume too. So if you want to actually just read the letters, you can look them up freely online, all sorts of other places. If you have access to the Fathers in hardbound, paperback, whatever, you can look it up there too. But you can read some back and forth between Cyprian and the Church of Rome. So his view of Rome, or his relationship with Rome, kind of shifts. So at first he's very supportive, and he does talk, highly about Peter, and yes, the Bishop of Rome as being the one that's in the seat of Peter. And then his attitude shifts as he gets into this debate. And so he has actually some pretty harsh criticisms even of the Bishop of Rome at this point, as do many other North African leaders in the church as well. So, but what happens is the Bishop of Rome at the time starts to use these claims of papal authority, being the successor of St. Peter, to try to justify what he's saying, and saying basically, Cyprian, I have the authority of Peter, my position is correct, and your position is wrong. Cyprian's response is not to say, oh yes, you are the Bishop of Rome, you're the head of the church, I will submit to what you say. He actually disputes and argues with him, and his authority claims, even to the point that there are provincial councils in North Africa that try to overthrow the claims of the Bishop of Rome at the time. So eventually that particular pope passes away. Cyprian then has better relations with the pope coming after it that does prevent total fracture in the church. Thankfully, things could have gotten a lot worse, and they were able to kind of resolve some of those things. Eventually, the North African church has the same resolution, especially with St. Augustine later, that yes, baptisms are valid if they're done by heretics, if they're done in the triune name in the proper way. So what that does show, though, is that in the early church, in the North African church, there was not an understanding of St. Peter, particularly among St. Cyprian, somebody who's very significant in the history of the church, and one who Rome often cites on various issues to try to bolster their claims. Even someone like Cyprian and the rest of the North African church, while they do honor the office of bishop, and they acknowledge the Bishop of Rome as someone significant, they certainly don't see his authority as absolute. They don't see his word as authoritative. They are able to argue against him both personally and through councils. So clearly they don't hold to the notion of papal infallibility. They don't have the same kind of idea of the office of the papacy that even the Bishop of Rome at that time would have claimed for themselves, but especially as it develops throughout the Middle Ages. So this is just one example if we look at Cyprian, and I think we have numerous examples where if you look at the Roman Catholic apologists and you take one thing that they've tried to argue for, here's quote X from this church father who says nice things about the Bishop of Rome. And then you look further into their writing and what's going on and what they actually believed and how they actually interacted with the papacy and the claims of the Bishop of Rome. It doesn't line up with what it might when you're reading just small selections from the fathers. So in Cyprian, we see a very different situation. And that's not just Cyprian. That's something we see, I think, throughout the church. So I am just about out of time. I'm feeling pretty miserable, but I'm glad I was able to get this out anyway. So I'm sure I'll receive lots of very kind comments. No, I don't know. But I know this is a polemical issue, so, it is what it is. So there will be some pushback, I'm sure. But, examine these things historically. And I think I would just encourage you, if you're looking into these questions, to just read the fathers themselves and read the fullness of what they're trying to argue and say. So I think the claim, because the Roman Catholic claim toward the Reformation is always going to be, your doctrines aren't taught in the church fathers. Well, most notably, your central idea of justification is not found in the fathers as it is in, Martin Luther and the later tradition. Now, we can debate that issue too, but I would make the same argument to say, if there's any central doctrine for you, it's the doctrine of the papacy. And all the claims you make about the papacy are ones that are absent from the earliest church. So you have the same difficulty that you're saying that we have. And maybe we'll do a later program dealing with the fathers on justification and the authority of traditions and things like that. But anyway, so thank you so much for listening or watching if you're checking out the video on YouTube, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. God bless.